Nathan Richardson had covered a lot of ground in his 28 years. After joining the Army as a mechanic in 2000 and then taking a job as a civilian with the Department of Defense, the Texas native had seen the world.
I was working for a travel division at my work. Sometimes you're gone for 6 months, sometimes for 2 or 3 weeks, and it was always somewhere different. I love to travel. I loved that life. It was great.
Unfortunately, love had taken a back seat to Nathan's travels until one day in November 2008. While working in Kuwait, Nathan happened to catch a glimpse of a buddy's gorgeous redheaded relative.
I'm not really into redheads, but thought, she's pretty.
She's a relative of mine.
Her name was Shannon Rogers, and Nathan found himself desperate to know more about her.
Sure.
So he was thrilled when his friend set up an email introduction.
We just sent emails back and forth, and she seemed like she had everything together. She was a real down-to-earth woman, just real easy to get along with.
He was excited. She was pretty, and she was very intelligent. She seemed to be just the right kind of person for him.
Through their correspondence, however, Nathan learned the two led very different lives. Shannon said she was a born and raised Georgia peach, a divorced mother of 5, and an up-and-coming actress.
She said she was in the show Walking Dead, as well as Drop Dead Divas, I believe, and Vampire Diaries. She wanted to be famous, but I'm a very private person. I'm definitely an introvert.
Despite their differences, Nathan was excited when Shannon suggested they meet in person. After returning home in April 2009, the two chose a restaurant halfway between Texas and Georgia.
Nathan?
And Nathan wasn't disappointed.
Hi.
When I first met her in person, I wasn't surprised at all. She was what I expected. I thought she was beautiful.
Conversation flowed easily, although Nathan couldn't help but notice Shannon spoke nonstop about her career.
Coming up.
She was a little bit more arrogant.
Filming. I've been working a lot with Matthew McConaughey. I have another one coming up.
I'm not too into actors and
Oh.
movies. And
Her attitude changed after that. She went back to more like the person I emailed with. And she was fun. She complimented my personality. Easygoing, no drama, just relaxed.
By the end of their date, Nathan knew it would be the first of many.
We'd meet in a location that was the same distance for both of us. And other times she would come all the way to Texas, or I'd go all the way to Georgia. Wherever we went, we had a good time. It just seemed so effortless to be in a relationship with her.
And Nathan was relieved when he met Shannon's boys, and they all hit it off famously.
I had a lot of fun with the boys. Shannon said she got divorced in 2004 because she said her ex-husband was almost like a monster. So it always made me feel like I should step in and take responsibility as a male role model.
By 2011, after 2 years together, Shannon began hinting they should take the next step in their relationship.
She said, as an actress, they can do their job from anywhere. It didn't seem to be a problem that she moved to Texas.
We were happy for him. We were hoping that she was what we would like to have in our family.
Although the circumstances under which those next steps began to unfold were not as celebratory as Nathan had hoped.
She called and she said she'd been to the doctor.
They did a CT scan and they found something.
It's a brain aneurysm.
oh my God.
Worried, Nathan rushed to Atlanta to tend to his girlfriend, but was surprised to find her in good spirits.
She said that it was supposedly early stages. She was just getting headaches.
I'm really fine,
But I was more worried about her well-being.
Nathan thought the smartest thing to do was move Shannon to Texas right away so he could keep watch over her and the kids. Once she'd officially become a Texan, the young couple decided to make their relationship official as well. That fall, the two tied the knot in Nathan's backyard with close family as witnesses.
I loved her, and she had my trust, and I think that just made it that much easier.
Nathan was ready to settle into wedded bliss. Instead, his life with Shannon would be anything but blissful, as he found himself cast as the unlikely villain in a plot that would shock the entire country.
You're almost like, I can't believe this is happening.
And they put handcuffs on me. I thought, what in the world's going on?
In the fall of 2011, newlyweds Nathan and Shannon Richardson settled into his Texas home together with her 5 sons. As Shannon dealt with the early stages of an aneurysm, Nathan realized how lucky he was to be with such an exceptional woman.
Shannon was intelligent, just sweet, funny. If we had any kind of disagreements, we'd talk through them, no problem. Things were looking good.
But to Nathan's surprise, just a week after the wedding, Shannon's personality seemed to suddenly change. The sweet, laid-back woman he'd fallen in love with was now acting downright pushy and demanding.
She was trying to order me around and trying to tell me what to do. So I said, I don't deserve this. I don't treat you this way.
You need to stop treating me like one of your kids.
And then she did a 180 and started going back the way she was before.
Soon, however, Nathan realized there were other aspects of Shannon's personality he'd never seen while apart.
She would start a fight before we went into some kind of public setting or people were going to come over.
What are you wearing? What is that?
She wanted me to seem like an angry person.
Get upstairs and change!
And it was hurting me. I feel like I was falling apart.
By November 2011, only 1 month into their marriage, Nathan couldn't help but wonder if he had made a mistake.
She was deliberately making my life a living hell.
I'm getting a lawyer.
But before he had a chance to file divorce papers, Shannon dropped some devastating news.
I went to the doctors earlier today, and they told me that I have brain cancer.
The way she put it, she wouldn't have much time to live. It was that bad. It was terrible.
Nathan couldn't help but wonder if this was the cause of Shannon's erratic behavior.
I thought, oh my gosh, maybe they misdiagnosed the aneurysm and it actually was cancer. We were just brokenhearted.
Despite the decline of their marriage, Nathan wasn't the kind of man who'd desert his wife in sickness.
She knew what kind of person I am. I take care of people I love.
Hey, where are you off to?
Just the doctor, something.
Let me come with you.
Oh, no, it's okay. It's just a routine checkup thing.
It seemed kind of a little strange that she didn't want me to go.
Well, at least give me the name of the doctor.
Why are you treating me like a child? You're not my father.
I said, no, I'm your husband, and I'd like to kind of know what's going on and talk to the doctor and see what the options are. And she wouldn't tell me a doctor's name.
As the months went by, even though their relationship was still a little rocky, Nathan stuck by Shannon's side. But it was difficult watching his wife's decline.
She went to Georgia to have some kind of a special chemotherapy. I don't really know exactly what all it was, but her skin was like a whitish, yellowish color. She lost a good, 10, 15 pounds, and her eyes looked more sunken in.
He was sad and he was hurting. He was manning up for the whole thing. You start the stages of grief before the loss, but you anticipate the loss.
I was never really worried for myself. It was more about the boys. I was worried about what they were gonna have to go through. I felt like if she did pass away, I wouldn't want him to go back to this monster ex-husband. I would have taken care of him.
But just when Nathan had finally wrapped his head around Shannon's devastating diagnosis, he received news of another unexpected development.
I was hoping that there was some mistake.
It was just horrible. We both sat there and bawled.
In January 2013, Nathan Richardson was still adjusting to learning his wife Shannon had brain cancer when he received more unsettling news.
Shannon sent me a picture of a pregnancy test. I was kind of shocked because she was supposed to be on birth control, and there was a possibility she wouldn't live long enough to have a child. And our relationship was up and down, and sometimes we were good, sometimes we weren't. So I definitely didn't want to have a child under those circumstances.
When Nathan spoke with Shannon later that day, she assured him that everything was under control.
There's a specialist in Georgia that I was gonna go see for a couple of days.
Well, I'll go with you. We'll go.
Oh, no. It's okay.
But I was never allowed to go.
For some reason, she wanted to keep it a secret, so we were concerned about that.
That spring, while Shannon's health seemed stable for the moment, Nathan's life took yet another dramatic turn when he received a phone call from a credit card company.
They said that a credit card had been opened in February. They were saying it was already maxed out, like $6,000 worth of credit card charges already. I said, oh, this is impossible. I asked what some of the charges were. It was places that Shannon liked to go shopping. I did a credit report to see what was going on. Ended up finding 6 other credit cards. They're all maxed out. I was pretty upset.
Nathan knew his wife was the only one who had access to his information.
Did you do this?
Maybe it was my ex-husband.
It didn't make any sense at all.
You think I did?
I was wasting
I
away.
can't believe this.
Emotionally, I was dying. And, depression. It was just too much to deal with anymore.
Nathan felt he had no choice but to visit his lawyer. So it was an especially crushing blow when he revealed a little-known Texas law.
Texas law doesn't allow you to complete a divorce when party is pregnant. You have to wait until after the child is born before you can complete the divorce.
For the next few months, Nathan felt trapped.
I was just trying to coexist with Shannon until I could figure something out, until she had the baby.
Nathan had no idea his life was about to go from bad to worse.
I was with a buddy at work. We were just having a good old time.
Excuse me. Are you Nathan Richardson? Yeah.
He didn't shake my hand.
Can I talk to you for a minute? What's this all about?
And I thought, whoa, what in the world's going on? Then he just put handcuffs on me.
What are you doing? What's this all about?
Hey, Nathan, what's going on, man?
Man, I don't know.
And it was just completely shocking. They put me in the back of the car, and I stayed in the car 2 hours. No one would tell me what was going on. I kept asking over and over again. Finally, the FBI showed up and asked if they could search my vehicle. I said, sure. But I was like, what is going on here?
Confused and clueless, Nathan was finally led to the security office on base, where FBI agents entered the room announcing this was a matter of national security.
He said, somebody's gonna go to jail for a really long time.
It was something you see in a movie.
On May 31st, 2013, Nathan Richardson was surrounded by the FBI.
I was starting to get angry because I didn't know what was going on.
Do you know why you're here?
Nathan's mouth hung wide open as agents revealed their reason for targeting him. Letters laced with the deadly poison ricin had been sent to several high-ranking officials.
The letters were sent to President Obama, Mayor Michael Bloomberg of New York City, and Mark Glaze, who is an anti-gun activist.
And the FBI had serious reason to believe Nathan was behind the terroristic threats.
I have no idea what you're talking about.
I thought it was a really bad joke. It's like your head and your heart, like all of a sudden just have like an attack at the same time.
I didn't do anything.
FBI and Secret Service agents continued to drill Nathan before he was finally released around midnight. For the next 3 weeks, Nathan stayed at his parents' while his house was under quarantine, with no word from Shannon.
We had 2 FBI agents stay outside the house. It was hard to sleep, it was hard to eat.
Luckily, through news reports, Nathan was beginning to piece together what had happened. And with every report, he sank further into shock. It turned out it was Shannon who'd gone to the FBI.
Shannon left one morning after he had gone to work. Kids were at school, and she drives to an FBI office in Shreveport. She said, "I think my husband sent these letters," and they had her sequestered away.
Shannon was trying to frame me as some kind of backwater, gun-toting, crazy person. She was pretty evil.
But a few weeks later, Nathan received a shred of promising news.
The FBI had 3 theories. He did it, she did it, or they did it together. And very early on, unbeknownst to Shannon, the FBI followed her, and at some point she made a statement to someone that she was going to run, and they went and arrested her. That's when she confessed to certain parts of what happened, but still claimed that Nathan was involved.
Shannon admitted that she had ordered the castor beans online, which she used to make the ricin. She claimed that on the morning of May 20th, 2013, she'd sent all 3 poisoned letters because Nathan had forced her.
You don't understand what he put me through. He made me do it.
But investigators weren't buying it.
There are date and time stamps on computers when you do things, and Nathan had alibis most of the time that anything was happening. And I think that clarified to them who was really involved.
On June 7, 2013, Shannon was charged in federal court with possessing and producing a biological toxin. While Nathan finally knew who had framed him, he struggled with why.
I think it was just her way of getting the attention that she's always craved.
But it wasn't until Nathan spoke with Shannon's previous husband that he learned the extent of her award-winning acting abilities.
She said she got divorced in 2004, which was a lie. She'd been divorced maybe 18 days before she married me.
And I'm really glad that
And her ex-husband was nothing like what she described. He was non-violent, real nice guy.
Nathan's mind raced back to Shannon's brain aneurysm and cancer diagnosis.
There was all kinds of deceit and lies, and the FBI told me she didn't have cancer. I think she was just starving herself. She was pretty good at doing makeup, so I wasn't surprised at all. It was just one more angle of control.
Nathan now viewed his reaction to Shannon's credit card fraud as the catalyst for her actions.
We think she was trying to go back to Georgia before the baby was born with the hope that he would be in jail and she would be able to get his house. I think she thought she had come up with the perfect way to get rid of a husband and get some notoriety.
In December 2013, Shannon Richardson pled guilty to all charges. 7 months later, she was sentenced to 18 years in prison, all the while soaking up her 15 minutes of fame.
She lives in her own world, and I think this is one of those cases where crazy applies.
18 years. That's a long time for a pretty lady who's not going to look so pretty by the time she gets out.
Her love was based off of what you did for me. And it really wasn't love, it was some kind of disease.
Today, now that his divorce is official, Nathan has done his best to move on, changing his appearance and his outlook in hopes of a fresh start.
I forgave her almost immediately. I don't think a lot of people understand what forgiveness is really all about. It's more about yourself and not the other person. They're not worth the energy it takes to hold on to it.
Nathan's much better, much calmer. He's back to being fun.
I'm happy. That's the main thing. I hadn't been happy in a long time. I was less like myself when I was with her. And now I'm more like me than I've ever been.
Matt Woods was always an uncle, never a dad. The Clymer, Pennsylvania native had watched while his siblings introduced 12 nieces and nephews into their small corner of the world.
I grew up the youngest of 6, so I came from a big family, and everyone in my family at that point had already had children. And I just always wanted to marry, settle down, and have kids of my own.
In the meantime, Matt focused on his career. And by 2008, the 35-year-old's hard work had paid off.
I worked for an oil and gas drilling exploration company. That's the guy who's in charge of the entire rig. I was financially secure. I felt like it was time that I could actually think about starting a family.
Then, one night that October, while hanging out with the guys at a local bar, Matt happened to notice Mary Jane McCracken.
When I first walked in to see her, she was sitting at the bar. Mary was the most beautiful woman in town. I've always heard guys talk about her before, but I had never actually talked to her myself.
Can I buy you a drink?
Yeah. Please, I'm all done.
Mary was a single mother, living on her own.
I have a 9-year-old daughter.
Oh, I love kids.
We spent most of the night talking and having fun.
Tales about Mary had been floating around Clymer for years, but they had nothing to do with her beauty.
I had heard stories about Mary and her ex and some of the fights they would have. One incident that I heard about that apparently she laid down in the middle of the road so he couldn't leave the house.
You're gonna have to run me over if you wanna leave. You wanna leave? Come on.
Everybody called her Crazy Mary. She had a lot of boyfriend problems and a lot of drama. She loved drama.
But in the presence of her infectious laugh, Matt saw a very different Mary.
I'm Matt.
I thought the person that I'm seeing didn't have the ability to be that type of person that people were saying she was.
You shouldn't believe all those stories.
Oh, yeah? You look pretty normal to me.
Thank you.
Having lived in a small town his whole life, Matt knew better than to put stock in rumors.
I found her to be funny and charming and everything I was basically looking for. With her having an older daughter, I kind of thought that she was looking to settle down and, with one guy, and be married.
Would you like to go out sometime?
I would love that.
Yeah?
Should I give you my number?
Yeah, that'd be great.
It wasn't long before Matt was rewarded for ignoring the town talk.
We spent a lot of time together. Everything seemed really good. I hadn't had a connection like that in a while. We always seemed to have fun together no matter what it was. Everything that I needed, she would always, take care of. And I liked being there for her in the same way.
After 4 months of dating, Matt had no doubts that Mary was the one.
Will you marry me?
Yes, I love it.
The time period was short, but I was very much in love with her.
Oh my God, I love it. It's so, oh my God.
That winter, Matt wed Mary in a small ceremony at her parents' house.
I felt lucky to be with Mary. Everything was perfect.
I was happy for him because it seemed like he finally found the one, that he was actually going to be with.
Just 1 month later, Matt's wish finally came true.
I have a surprise for you.
I was very excited.
Are you serious?
That was everything that I had wanted. I wanted to be a father, and that was the most important thing.
Oh my God.
But just a few months into her pregnancy, Matt started to notice another side to Mary's personality.
I was very surprised by the way little things would set her off.
What is wrong with you? Why is this laundry not done?
Whoa, what?
It was a matter of laundry not being put in laundry baskets and dishes in the sink. Little things like that. I kind of chalked it up to it being like the stress from being married. Everything that her life basically had just completely changed. Both of ours had.
However, when Matt's best friend of 10 years passed away, he wondered if Mary's anger issues were indicative of a larger problem.
On the way home from the burial, Mary wanted to stop and get groceries.
I'm asking you to do one simple little thing.
But we just buried my best friend, and I told her it's not something I feel like going and doing right now. So when we get home, she asked me where I was going.
If you want to go to the store, then you go on your own, okay? But I'm not going, all right?
If I wanted to go by myself, then I wouldn't say we need to go.
I've had it.
That is when she totally lost it.
If You go. It's over.
She was throwing things at my car. And the look on her face and just the anger that she had was amazing. I mean, it was something I've never seen.
I hate you so much. Where do you think you're
As Matt peeled out of the driveway, his brain was spinning as fast as his wheels. He was starting to think he might have underestimated the rumor mill.
Everything just got more and more bizarre.
She was really off the deep end.
I had no idea who I'd married.
In the spring of 2009, Matt Woods had to escape his home after his pregnant wife, Mary, flew into a rage.
I never could have dreamed about or ever would have thought someone could be so crazy. Drove straight to one of my friend's house. I ended up spending the night there.
The next morning, Matt felt it was safe to return home, where he found a repentant Mary.
Babe, I am so sorry about yesterday. I just totally lost it. It must be hormones or I don't know.
So I kind of thought it was just a one-time deal. Like, okay, she understood how out of line that was, and that'll probably never happen again.
I just want us to be together.
Me too.
Unfortunately, as the weeks went by, the drama continued.
She was accusing him of cheating on her. Matt is a very loyal person, and none of us believed any of the stories that were coming out of her mouth.
I think in her stage of her life, she just wanted to be married and happy and raise a family. I really felt bad for her that he would even do something like that.
Don't think you're gonna get away with this. You're nuts. What?
There was no convincing her that I was not cheating.
Don't you dare lie to me.
Matt did his best to try and defuse the situation.
You, I cheat on you. Mary, listen. Calm down. There.
I had hoped that once the baby was born that things would go back to normal, like they were in the very beginning. So I was willing to stick around and deal with it.
But after they welcomed their healthy baby girl on October 9th, Mary's jealous behavior only continued.
I want to know how many women there are. Where's your phone? Yes.
It had gotten pretty bad. It kept getting worse and worse.
Matt decided to put some space between them and stayed at his family's lake house.
The next thing I knew, the sheriff's department showed up at my door to serve me with a PFA, which is a protection from abuse order that Mary had filed against me.
A what?
What that means is you do not go near your wife.
Mary claimed that Matt had held a knife to her throat, which we know is not true. Matt would never do that.
Can't see my own
It also
daughter?
listed my daughter on it, meaning that I couldn't go near my daughter for months without being arrested. I just felt totally betrayed.
Matt was completely caught off guard when a few months later, Mary called asking to drop by the lake house with their daughter.
I was just more than willing to let her come out so I could see my daughter, make sure my daughter was okay. My daughter was and still is everything to me.
Mary begged Matt for forgiveness and asked him to come back home. She even said she would drop the PFA.
I don't know what's wrong with me. I mean, I'm gonna get help. I will. I'll get help. I promise.
Matt once again found himself considering a reconciliation.
I wanted to try it again. Maybe we would have a chance to keep the marriage together. And it also allowed me to see my daughter whenever I wanted to.
Initially, Matt felt like he had a brand new wife. But by the summer of 2012, the old Mary was back.
You don't do anything around here.
I constantly felt like I was walking around on eggshells. There was nothing you could do to make her happy. I wasn't attracted to her. And she knew it. It had actually gotten to the point where I was sleeping downstairs on the couch. And it had gotten to be our routine, where she knew I wasn't coming to bed. I had plans on not being around much longer because I just wasn't going to deal with it any longer.
So it was a rare moment of intimacy they shared at Matt's brother's wedding that July.
That was the first time we'd been together physically in a long time. We'd both probably had a little too much to drink.
Matt was shocked when 4 weeks later, Mary told him she was pregnant.
It was the way I am. She knew it would keep me there with her, the fact that we're having another child.
Oh my gosh.
When Matt and Mary got pregnant with their second child, We all pretty much couldn't figure out what was going on. And we didn't understand why would you want to have another kid and bring it into this toxic relationship.
Matt was worried how it would affect Mary's behavior. And 3 months after the birth of their son, he was astonished to see how far she would go. On July 23, 2013, Matt returned home from a safety seminar.
I woke up with her standing above me.
God, you make me crazy!
I had no idea what she was talking about. She started screaming that she followed me that day and I didn't go to a class.
At a loss, Matt went to retrieve the paperwork he'd received for completing the class. But before he could move, Mary pulled her biggest stunt yet.
I just could not believe it.
You have crossed the line for the last time, buddy!
How do you even defend yourself against something that crazy?
On July 23, 2013, Matt Woods found himself in one hell of a fight with his wife, Mary.
She said that myself and some guys that I worked with were actually renting a house and would go there and make porn movies. And we were putting it on the internet.
What is going on with the film and the prostitutes and the...
Mary insisted she had evidence.
Oh my God, you are insane.
She just kept on with the accusations. She claimed that we had expensive cameras and that it was a wardrobe department, and actually we were hiring people to make these movies for us, doing all kinds of crazy stuff. At that point, I started walking towards the door.
I am out of here.
Oh, okay.
Unfortunately, Matt's unwillingness to fight only further enraged Mary.
She just came at me, punching me,
Mary, stop it!
ripped my shirt off. She said she was going to ruin my life. I made my way out the door, and at that point, I just decided I was going to call 911.
But Mary beat him to it.
I need police right away.
When the police arrived, Matt did his best to explain what had happened.
She started attacking me and just clawing at me.
I was defending myself.
The next blow Mary delivered stung worse than any fist could.
Mary actually accused me of touching our daughter.
She does it when she's in the tub.
Where's your daughter?
I just got so angry that I started to shake. It was like a kick in the stomach.
After giving their statements, Matt and Mary ultimately decided not to pursue charges.
I just want to get away from her. I just want to leave right now, okay? That's probably a good idea.
I did feel bad leaving the kids, but I had to. It was just going to escalate into something even worse.
Mary told me that he was running an escort service. He was making porn movies. I thought that was totally disgusting.
For the next few weeks, Matt stayed at the lake house, but desperately missed his kids.
He was very depressed, and he became really withdrawn. Kids are his world. I mean, everything he does is for his kids.
Unfortunately, when he returned home to see them, Mary refused.
2 days after, I got a call from the sheriff's department.
The deputy said Mary had filed another protection from abuse order against Matt, claiming he was threatening her.
She said what?
She said she didn't feel safe with me coming around the house and being around the kids. I couldn't believe this was happening.
A few weeks later, a hearing determined that the PFA would stay in place for the standard term of 3 years. Matt couldn't go near the house or Mary, but was allowed supervised visits with his children.
She absolutely was keeping me from my kids. That was the only leverage at that point she had, and she knew what to do with it.
And Mary wasn't finished just yet. On August 15th, 2013, when the phone rang,
Hi, Matt Woods?
Matt wasn't surprised at all to find a police officer on the line.
His first question was, did I have any idea what my wife was accusing me of?
Matt's mind immediately flashed back to Mary's child abuse claims.
Touches our daughter.
I wasn't worried because I knew that she had nothing on me.
What do you mean? What am I?
But the corporal went on to say Mary brought her computer full of proof to the police barracks. And Matt's heart sank when he told him what was on it.
Oh my God, this...
She wanted to make his life a living hell.
Investigators were shocked with the evidence that Mary gave them. It was very, very disturbing.
He shouldn't be on the streets.
That is the worst accusation a woman could ever make against a man.
On August 15th, 2013, Matt Woods was in shock when police told him what his estranged wife, Mary, was accusing him of.
I need to file a complaint against my husband right away.
She made a claim that I had been doing things on our computer at home that led her to get on the computer. She happened to come across these pictures of child pornography. She was claiming one was one of my nieces and one was my daughter.
These awful images were downloaded by my...
Investigators gasped as they discovered 43 disturbing photos on the computer.
The images were some of the most vile images of child pornography that I've ever seen in my career.
He is a psycho.
Mary indicated that it was her husband that had not only downloaded these materials, but that Matt had created child pornography using their own children and images of their children.
Definitely the worst accusation a woman could ever make against a man is that he's a child molester or a pedophile. I was in total shock that she would take it this far.
When Matt met face-to-face with the corporal, he thought for sure they were going to lock him up and throw away the key, which is why he was entirely shocked when instead, the corporal revealed he had suspicions about Mary's story.
When we were trying to corroborate and check things, it just didn't make a whole lot of sense. The images were downloaded onto the computer at dates that were after Matt Woods had removed himself from the Merrill residence and did not have access to the computer. You could not identify who the person was, let alone whether it was her child or someone else's child that was being depicted.
I wasn't home when these...
Very early on, we believed that there was more to the story than what she was giving us.
He's involved in making pornographic movies with his brother, using prostitutes.
And it became very evident the allegations just were not accurate.
Why would you want to do such a heinous thing? I just could not believe that she would go to the lengths that she did. And it was unreal for me.
She was attempting to set him up in order to advance her position with regard to an upcoming custody and divorce battle.
She realized I wasn't coming back, and she just wanted to somehow get back at me. I mean, you only do this for one reason, and that's to get back at somebody and hurt them as bad as you can.
That's a sick man.
This time, Mary had gone way too far. On August 14th, she was charged with sexual abuse of a child for downloading child pornography and unsworn falsification to law enforcement.
Obviously, downloading child pornography is a very serious offense. It's a felony, punishable by up to 7 years imprisonment. It also carries with it a sexual registration piece.
Mary maintained her innocence, and on August 20th, 2014, she had her day in court.
Mary's lawyers during the trial had hired a forensic computer expert of their own, and she attempted to say that the download stamps were not reliable. Clearly, in this case, the jury did not buy that.
After 90 minutes of deliberations, Mary Jane Woods was convicted on all charges. She was sentenced to a maximum of 2 years in prison.
The judge ordered that she undergo a sexual offender's assessment. The judge also ordered that Mary undergo a mental health evaluation and also submit to anger management classes.
I feel it's completely justified that Mary went to jail. I don't believe Mary had any other motive but revenge. Just to get me. You know, she said to me that she was going to ruin my life, and she tried her best.
Today, Matt counts his blessings that the law was on his side. He hopes to show that even the strongest men can fall victim to abuse.
There was obviously red flags that I ignored. I tried to make things work and hope it would change. But she'd been more willing to walk away in the very beginning. Sadly, eventually, I found out why people call her Crazy Mary.
Matt's scars are beginning to heal. He refuses to let his ordeal keep him from his dreams of having a loving family.
Matt is doing a lot better now that the conviction's behind him. He gets to see his kids more. He doesn't have to deal with her.
Mary took a lot of time away from me with my kids, and really just a lot of peace of mind. I want going forward for me and my kids to have a normal life.
The Florida heat in 1982 wasn't just a temperature, it was a physical weight, a thick, suffocating blanket that smelled of salt water, asphalt, and stagnant swamp. In a quiet neighborhood where the palm trees stood like silent sentinels, the suburban dream was about to dissolve into a waking nightmare. Imagine a street where every lawn is manicured, every porch light is a beacon of safety, and every neighbor knows your name, or so you think. On a humid Tuesday night, the air went still. A young woman, full of life and tomorrow's promises, stepped into the shadows of her own driveway. She didn't scream. There was no struggle heard by the families watching sitcoms just yards away. She simply vanished into the heavy, tropical air, leaving behind nothing but a half-open car door and a chilling silence that would last for over 40 years. This isn't just a cold case, it is a testament to the fact that monsters don't always hide in the woods. Sometimes, they sit on their front porch, sip lemonade, and wave at you every morning while the blood on their hands dries into the fabric of a normal life. The morning sun of 1982 rose over a scene of quiet devastation. When the police cruisers finally rolled into the driveway, the atmosphere shifted from suburban peace to a high-voltage crime scene. Detectives moved through the grass like ghosts, their brows furrowed under the brim of their hats, looking for a sign, any sign, of where she had gone. There were no cameras in 1982. No digital footprints. No GPS pings to track a final movement. There was only the physical evidence, a stray earring, a scuff mark on the pavement, and the agonizing realization that she was gone. The community watched from behind lace curtains, a collective shiver running through the neighborhood. It couldn't happen here, they whispered. But it had. As the yellow tape fluttered in the breeze, the search began, a desperate, frantic crawl through the Florida brush, diving into tea-colored canals and knocking on doors that remained stubbornly shut. The initial investigation was a whirlwind of sirens and shouting, the chaotic race against a clock that was already ticking toward a dead end. Days turned into weeks, and the missing posters began to fade under the relentless Florida sun. The headlines grew smaller, moved from the front page to the back, until they disappeared entirely. The leads were thin, a white van seen idling near the corner, a mysterious man in a denim jacket, a phone call that ended in a hang-up, but nothing stuck. Detectives sat in smoke-filled rooms, staring at a corkboard that offered no answers, only empty spaces. The neighborhood, once a place of unlocked doors and midnight walks, transformed into a fortress of suspicion. Every man walking his dog was a suspect, every unfamiliar car was a threat. Yet, as the months bled into years, the fear cuddled into a dull, aching habit. The family of the victim stayed in that house, staring at the driveway every night, waiting for a ghost to return. They didn't know that the answer wasn't miles away in some hidden grave or a far-off city. The answer was breathing the same air, walking the same sidewalk, and watching the police tape come down from a window just 3 blocks away. Decades passed like a slow-motion blur. The 1980s gave way to the neon 90s, the digital revolution of the 2000s, and the social media age of the 2010s. For most of the world, the 1982 disappearance was a tragic footnote, a cold case filed away in a dusty basement in a box labeled with a number rather than a name. But for the cold case investigators who refused to let it go, that box was a ticking bomb. Technology was the fuse. While the killer grew gray, raised a family, attended neighborhood barbecues, and retired with a clean record, the world of forensics was undergoing a silent revolution. The tiny, microscopic traces of biological matter collected back in 1982, samples that were once considered useless, were now the most powerful weapons in the legal arsenal. The case wasn't dead, it was just waiting for the science to catch up to the scene. In a sterile lab, thousands of miles from that humid Florida street, a technician placed a vial into a machine, beginning a process that would bridge a 40-year gap and drag a monster out of the light of normalcy. The breakthrough didn't come with a dramatic confession or a sudden witness. It came with a string of numbers, a DNA profile. Genetic genealogy, the same technology people use to find long-lost cousins, became the ultimate snitch. Detectives began to map a family tree, branching out through distant relatives and third cousins, narrowing the search area until the circle began to tighten around a single geographic point. The map didn't lead to a prison or a transient camp. It led right back to the very neighborhood where it all began. The investigators couldn't believe the data. They checked it twice, then 3 times. The profile pointed to a man who had lived a life of unremarkable virtue. A man who paid his taxes, mowed his grass every Saturday, and was known by his neighbors as the quiet guy who wouldn't hurt a fly. The shock of the realization was a physical blow to the department. He wasn't a drifter. He wasn't a serial killer moving across state lines. He was a pillar of the community, a man who had been hiding in plain sight for 42 years. The surveillance began in the shadows of the modern Florida suburb. Detectives in unmarked cars watched the target, now an elderly man, go about his daily routine. They watched him get his mail. They watched him buy groceries. They watched him interact with grandchildren. It was a surreal juxtaposition, the image of a grandfatherly figure against the gruesome details of the 1982 file. How does a man commit such an atrocity and then simply stop? How does he look at his own children and not see the face of the woman he destroyed? The tension was electric. The police needed a fresh sample, a direct match to seal the deal. They waited for a discarded coffee cup, a cigarette butt, a piece of trash, anything that carried the blueprint of a killer. When they finally secured it, the lab result came back in record time. It was a 1 in a billion match. The ghost of 1982 finally had a name, a face, then a current address. The arrest was a lightning strike on a clear day. When the tactical team swarmed the quiet street, the neighbors didn't see a criminal being taken down, they saw a local legend being hauled away in handcuffs. "You have the wrong man," they shouted from their porches. "He's been here forever." The killer didn't fight. He didn't scream. There was only a hollow, vacant look in his eyes, the look of a man who had been expecting this knock for nearly half a century. As he was led to the cruiser, he walked past the very spot where the victim had been taken. He didn't look down. He didn't look at the house 3 blocks away where a family had spent 4 decades mourning. The normal life he had built was a house of cards, and the wind had finally arrived. The news hit the community like a sonic boom. The realization that they had shared fences, borrowed tools, and celebrated holidays with a predator was a trauma that would never truly heal. As the interrogation began, the mask of the good neighbor finally slipped. In the stark, fluorescent light of the interview room, the details of that night in 1982 began to emerge, not from words, but from the crushing weight of the evidence. He had watched her for weeks. He knew her schedule. He knew when the street went quiet. He had lived so close that he could hear the sirens of the first responders from his own bedroom. He had watched the search parties from his porch. He had even, in a display of sickening bravado, offered to help the family look for her in the early days. It was a level of psychopathy that defied logic, a man who could compartmentalize a murder so completely that he could live a normal life just a few hundred yards from the crime scene. He didn't just escape justice, he taunted it by staying exactly where he was. The trial was a journey back in time. For the victim's family, it was a confrontation with a monster they had unwittingly passed in the grocery store for years. The courtroom was packed with people who had known him, people who were now forced to reckon with the fact that they never truly knew him at all. The evidence was undeniable. The DNA, the cold, hard facts of science, spoke for a woman who could no longer speak for herself. Every witness, every old detective brought out of retirement, every piece of yellowed paperwork served as a brick in the wall that was finally closing in on him. The defense tried to argue for the kind old man he had become, but the prosecution focused on the merciless predator he had been. Justice, though delayed by a lifetime, was finally standing at the door. When the verdict was read, guilty, there were no cheers. Only a heavy, somber silence. The sentence didn't bring the victim back. It didn't erase the 40 years of birthdays, Christmases, and milestones that were stolen. But it did something else. It proved that time is not a sanctuary for the guilty. It proved that no matter how many blocks you live from the scene, no matter how many decades you spend pretending to be a good man, the truth is a bloodhound that never loses the scent. The killer would spend his final days behind bars, stripped of the normal life he had stolen from someone else. The quiet Florida neighborhood would never be the same. The shadow of 1982 would always linger under the palm trees, a reminder that the person next door might be carrying a secret that could freeze the blood in your veins. The case of Florida 1982 is closed, but the echoes remain. It serves as a haunting reminder to every community that the most dangerous people aren't always the ones we fear from afar. They are the ones who blend in. They are the ones who are just blocks away. As the sun sets over that Florida street today, the porch lights flicker on, one by one. But the trust is gone. The mystery of why he stayed, how he lived with himself, and what else he might have done remains a dark stain on the soul of the town. The victim finally has her name back, her story told, and her killer identified. But for those who lived through it, the real horror isn't that she was taken, it's that the man who took her was always right there, watching, waiting, and waving hello from the sidewalk. The silence that followed the 1982 disappearance wasn't just the absence of sound, it was a heavy, suffocating presence that settled over the cul-de-sac like a thick coastal fog. While the sirens faded into the distance and the news cameras packed up their tripods, a more insidious reality began to take root in the soil of this Florida suburb. We have to look closer at the man who stayed, the man who didn't run. In most criminal profiles, the predator flees. They put miles between themselves and the bloodstain. They change their names, they move to different states, they vanish into the anonymity of the American highway. But not this time. This killer did something far more terrifying. He stayed. He watched the property values rise and fall. He watched the victims' parents age, their hair turning silver and their backs stooping under the weight of a grief that never found an exit. He was there when the neighborhood kids played stickball in the street, the same street where he had snuffed out a life just moments before the world went dark. Think about the sheer, icy nerves required to look a grieving father in the eye over a backyard fence and ask if there's any news from the police. Picture the monster sitting in his living room, the flickering light of a 19-inch tube television casting shadows on the wall, while just 3 blocks away, a bedroom remained exactly as it was on the night of the abduction, posters of pop stars still taped to the walls, a half-finished diary on the nightstand, a life frozen in amber. This wasn't just a crime of passion, it was a crime of proximity. The killer wasn't a shadow in the woods, he was a fixture of the community. He was the man who offered to help jumpstart a car. He was the man who donated to the local church. He was the man who, for 42 years, wore the mask of the average Joe so convincingly that the mask eventually became his face. But beneath that mask, the memory of 1982 remained as vivid as a fresh wound, a secret kept in the dark, cold cellar of his mind. The investigation in the early 80s was a brutal lesson in the limitations of human effort. Detectives back then were working with Polaroids, yellow legal pads, and the unreliable memories of witnesses who were more interested in their own lives than the tragedy unfolding next door. They scoured the Everglades, their boots sinking into the black muck, swatting away mosquitoes the size of quarters, looking for a shallow grave that didn't exist. They checked every white van in the Tri-County area, a Herculean task that yielded a mountain of paperwork but 0 suspects. The lead investigator, a man whose name has since been carved into a retirement plaque, spent his nights staring at the grainy photos of the crime scene. He knew, he felt it in his gut, that the answer was close. He felt the eyes of the killer on the back of his neck whenever he visited the neighborhood. But in a world before the double helix of DNA became the ultimate witness, a gut feeling was just a whisper in a hurricane. As the 1980s bled into the 90s, the case became a ghost story. The house where she lived was sold, then sold again. New families moved in, unaware that their hardwood floors had once been paced by a mother waiting for a daughter who would never come home. The killer, meanwhile, was flourishing. He was building a resume of normalcy. He got married. He had children of his own. Imagine the psychological dissonance of tucking your own daughter into bed, pulling the covers up to her chin, while knowing exactly what you did to someone else's child just a few streets over. Did he feel a pang of guilt? Or did he feel a surge of power, a sick satisfaction in knowing that he had beaten the system, that he was smarter than the badges and the sirens? He became a phantom who lived in the light, a predator who hid in the most obvious place possible, right in front of everyone. Then came the digital age, and with it, the slow awakening of the cold case unit. These were the hunters of the past, detectives who viewed time not as an enemy, but as a filter. They knew that people talk. They knew that secrets rot. And they knew that science was moving at a pace that the killer could never have imagined in 1982. In a climate-controlled evidence room, the box sat on a high shelf. Inside that box was a piece of clothing, preserved in plastic, carrying the microscopic signature of a murderer. 4 decades, that signature was illegible. It was a smudge, a blur, or nothing. But in the mid-2020s, the technology changed. A new process, liquid chromatography combined with advanced mass spectrometry, allowed technicians to isolate DNA fragments that were previously considered degraded beyond repair. The hunt was no longer about knocking on doors, it was about decoding the language of life itself. When the lab finally generated a profile, it didn't match anyone in the criminal database. The killer had been careful. He hadn't been arrested for a bar fight, he hadn't been caught shoplifting. He was a clean man. This is where the story takes its most dramatic turn, the rise of investigative genetic genealogy. Detectives uploaded the killer's DNA to public heritage databases, looking for hits among the millions of people who had submitted their saliva to find out if they were 10% Irish or 5% Scandinavian. They weren't looking for the killer, they were looking for his family. And they found them. A second cousin in Oregon. A great aunt in Georgia. Slowly, like a jigsaw puzzle being assembled in a dark room, the family tree began to take shape. The branches narrowed. The leaves fell away. And there, at the base of the tree, was a single name. A name that lived 3 blocks from the crime scene. The shock within the department was palpable. They looked at his address. They looked at his history. No criminal record. No red flags. He was a ghost with a social security number. The detectives began a 24-hour watch, a cinematic stakeout that lasted for weeks. They watched him through long-range lenses. They saw him watering his hibiscus plants. They saw him taking out the trash. They saw him living the very life he had denied his victim. Every time he smiled at a neighbor, the detectives felt a surge of cold fury. That cold case was suddenly red hot. They needed a direct sample, the discarded item that could link his current body to the 1982 crime. They waited for him to go to a local diner. They watched him eat a sandwich, his hands steady, his demeanor calm. When he walked out, leaving a crumpled napkin and a half-drunk cup of coffee, the investigators moved in like hawks. The lab result was the final nail in the coffin of his 4-decade lie. The DNA on the coffee cup was an identical match to the DNA found on the victim's clothing. The science had spoken. The past had caught up. That good neighbor, he was a monster. The arrest wasn't just a legal procedure, it was a cultural earthquake for the neighborhood. When the blue lights finally illuminated his driveway, the same driveway he had used every day since the crime, the realization set in. He wasn't just a killer, he was a squatter in the house of morality. He had stolen 40 years of freedom, 40 years of sunsets, and 40 years of peace from a community that had trusted him. As he was laid away, the neighbors stood on their lawns, the same lawns he had walked past 1,000 times, and the silence of 1982 was finally broken by the clicking of handcuffs and the heavy tread of justice. But the story doesn't end with a pair of cuffs. It opens a deeper, more disturbing question about the nature of evil. How many others are out there? How many quiet guys are sitting on their porches right now, watching the world go by, while the evidence of their darkest hour sits in a box waiting for the right machine to read it? This case proved that the perimeter of a crime scene isn't measured in yards or miles, it's measured in years. The killer lived his life in the shadow of his own sin, and in doing so, he turned an entire neighborhood into an unwitting accomplice to his escape. The resolution of this case isn't just a victory for the police, it's a warning to every predator who thinks that time is a shield. Time is actually a trap. And in Florida, where the heat never lets up and the swamps never forget, the trap finally snapped shut. The weight of this discovery continues to ripple through the legal system. It challenges our understanding of rehabilitation and the statute of limitations on a soul. Can a man truly be normal if he carries such a secret? Or was his entire life, the marriage, the children, the career, simply a long-form performance, a cinematic masterpiece of deception designed to keep him out of a cage? As we look at the photos of him from the 80s, with his feathered hair and his easy smile, and compare them to the mugshot of the broken, gray-haired man in the orange jumpsuit, we see the true cost of a cold case. We see the decades of stolen time. And we realize that for the victim, the clock stopped in 1982, but for the killer, the clock was always ticking, counting down to the moment when a coffee cup and a computer program would strip away the mask of the neighbor and reveal the face of the devil. The heavy steel doors of the interrogation room slammed shut, a sound that echoed like a gavel in the silence of the precinct. For 42 years, the truth had been buried under layers of suburban banality, but now, the air was thick with the scent of ozone and old secrets. As detectives laid out the photographs, the frozen, grainy images of the 1982 crime scene, the man across the table didn't flinch. He looked at the evidence with the detached curiosity of a historian, a chilling display of the sociopathy that had allowed him to thrive in the shadow of his own atrocity. But the investigation was no longer confined to that room. While he sat in silence, the different kind of storm was breaking just 3 blocks away. A team of forensic specialists, clad in white Tyvek suits that shimmered under the Florida sun, was descending upon his pristine, ranch-style home. They weren't looking for a body, they were looking for the trophies of a ghost. The neighbors watched, paralyzed, as investigators began to peel back the layers of a normal life. They didn't just search the closets, they searched the crawl spaces, the attic insulation, and the very foundation of the house. What they found was a psychological map of a predator who had never truly moved on. Hidden behind a false wall in the garage, the space he had used for decades to work on his vintage cars, was a metal lockbox. Inside wasn't money or jewelry. It was a macabre archive, newspaper clippings from 1982, yellowed and brittle, a single keychain that didn't belong to him, and a collection of Polaroids taken in the dead of night, documenting the quiet movements of the neighborhood he had terrorized. He hadn't just lived there. He had been a spectator to the aftermath, a silent fan of his own carnage who kept the program from the opening night. The courtroom became a theater of the surreal. When the prosecution presented the contents of that lockbox, the collective gasp of the gallery was audible. This wasn't a man who had made a mistake and spent a lifetime regretting it. This was a man who had curated his crime like a museum exhibit. The good neighbor defense vanished in an instant, replaced by the terrifying reality of a collector who had been hiding in plain sight. Expert witnesses took the stand, breaking down the cold, hard mathematics of the DNA match, but it was the physical evidence from the house that truly broke the community's spirit. The realization hit home. He had been reliving that night every time he stepped into his garage. He had been a predator in a state of permanent hibernation, waiting, watching, and holding on to the fragments of a stolen life as if they were his most prized possessions. As the trial reached its crescendo, the prosecution revealed the most damning detail of all, a detail that had been overlooked for 4 decades. Among the items in the lockbox was a map of the neighborhood, hand-drawn in 1982. On it, he had marked the houses of every young woman who lived alone. He hadn't chosen his victim by chance, he had hunted her with the precision of a military operation. The proximity wasn't a coincidence or a matter of convenience, it was part of the thrill. He wanted to hear the sirens. He wanted to see the flashing lights from his window. He wanted to feel the vibration of the search helicopters over his roof. To him, the neighborhood wasn't a community, it was a private hunting ground, and every neighbor was either a target or an unwitting extra in his twisted drama. The defense's final plea that he was an old man, a grandfather, a man who had contributed to society, fell on deaf ears. The jury saw through the gray hair and the frail posture. They saw the man who had walked 3 blocks in the humidity of 1982, destroyed a family's universe, and then walked back home to sleep in his own bed. The verdict was more than a legal conclusion, it was an exorcism. As the guilty count rang out, the weight that had hung over the street for 42 years finally began to lift, but it left behind a scar that would never fully fade. The normal life was exposed as the ultimate lie, a 40-year performance that finally ended when the curtain was pulled back by a drop of DNA and a locked box in a suburban garage. The predator was no longer a neighbor, he was a prisoner of the past he had tried so hard to preserve. The verdict didn't just end a trial, it shattered the final illusions of a community that had lived in the shadow of a monster for 42 years. As the bailiffs moved in to escort the man away, the courtroom felt like it was under a vacuum, the air thin, the pressure mounting. He stood up, his joints creaking, the image of a frail retiree suddenly replaced by the chilling posture of the predator he had always been. Before they led him through the side door, he leaned toward the lead detective, the man who had spent his career chasing a ghost, and whispered 6 words that would haunt the precinct for decades to come: "You only found what I kept." It was a final, jagged blade twisted into the heart of the investigation, a suggestion that the 1982 case was just the tip of a much deeper, much darker iceberg. The fallout was immediate and visceral. In the houses just blocks away from the crime scene, families began to look at their own walls with suspicion. If he had hidden a lockbox in his garage, what was hidden in their crawl spaces? What had been buried under the foundations of the new developments built in the 90s? The normal life he lived was now a roadmap of deception that forensic teams were forced to re-examine. They returned to his property, this time with ground-penetrating radar. The quiet suburban street was once again transformed into a tactical zone. They weren't just looking for physical evidence anymore, they were looking for other names, other dates, other families who had been told their loved ones simply ran away. The neighborly wave he had given for 40 years now felt like a curse, a calculated gesture to keep the world from looking too closely at the ground beneath his feet. For the survivors, the closure was a jagged pill. The victim's brother, now a man in his 50s with children of his own, stood in the driveway where it all began. He looked at the house 3 blocks away, the house with the hibiscus plants and the well-kept lawn, and realized he had walked past his sister's killer 1,000 times. He had seen him at the grocery store. He had seen him at the local gas station. The psychological trauma wasn't just in the loss of his sister, but in the theft of his reality. Every memory of his childhood neighborhood was now tainted by the presence of a predator who had used their grief as a shield. The killer hadn't just taken a life, but he had colonized their peace, turning their sanctuary into a hunting ground where he remained the master of ceremonies for nearly half a century. As the transport van moved toward the state penitentiary, the documents from his normal life were being shredded by the weight of the truth. His marriage records, his employment history at the local utility company, his perfect driving record, all of it was a facade for a man who lived in the pulses of the night. Detectives began scouring old missing persons files from across the state, looking for any pattern that matched his movements during his working years. They found chilling overlaps: their disappearance in Orlando in 1988, an unsolved case in Tampa in 1994. The map of his life was being redrawn in blood. He wasn't just a local anomaly, he was a silent, efficient machine of tragedy who understood that the best way to hide a dark heart is to keep the exterior perfectly polished. The final image of the Florida 1982 case isn't the arrest or the trial. It's the silence that remains in the neighborhood today. A new family has moved into the killer's house, but they don't stay out late. The hibiscus plants have withered, and the garage where the lockbox was found remains padlocked and empty. The community has learned a terrifying truth: the monster doesn't always live under the bridge. Sometimes, he lives in a ranch-style house with a silver mailbox and a friendly smile. The case is solved in the eyes of the law, but for the people who live just blocks away, the mystery has only deepened. They are left wondering if the man they knew was ever there at all, or if they had spent 40 years living next to a hollow shell, a cinematic villain who played the role of a neighbor so well that he almost started to believe it himself. The whisper in the courtroom didn't just hang in the air, it traveled down the state highways like a shockwave, turning a single solved case into a terrifying question mark that hovered over the entire peninsula. You only found what I kept. That sentence forced detectives to tear down the borders of their investigation. The perimeter was no longer 3 blocks wide, it was the size of Florida itself. They began to pull the threads of his employment history, and what they found chilled them to the bone. For 20 years, the man who mowed his lawn on Saturdays had worked as a meter reader and utility contractor. It was the perfect camouflage. He had a uniform. He had a clipboard. He had a legitimate reason to walk through backyards, to check fences, to peer into windows, and to map out the lives of strangers without ever raising a single eyebrow. He wasn't just a neighbor, he was a transient ghost with a laminated ID badge, a predator who turned his workday into a scouting mission. The timeline began to bleed outward. Investigators overlaid his work routes from the 1980s and 90s with the locations of unsolved disappearances, and the map lit up like a switchboard. The first red flag rose from the humid interior of Orlando, 1988. It was a case that had stumped local authorities for decades, a young nursing student who vanished from a laundromat parking lot on a rainy Tuesday. At the time, witnesses reported seeing a utility van parked near the entrance, its engine idling, the driver invisible behind the rain-slicked glass. The case had gone cold, dismissed as a random abduction or a runaway situation. But now, looking at the logs, detectives saw that he was there. He had been assigned to a grid just 2 streets over, checking power lines after a summer storm. The coincidence was mathematically impossible to ignore. The good neighbor was in Orlando that day, miles from his family, miles from his reputation, operating in a zone where he was nothing but a face in a uniform. Then the focus shifted west to the sprawling urban heat of Tampa in 1994. This time, the victim was a single mother who disappeared while waiting for a bus. Her purse was found in a drainage ditch, her body was never recovered. The file was thin, a testament to the lack of leads, but a single detail stood out in the faded police report. A witness had mentioned a man in a grey work shirt asking for directions near the bus stop. No name, no face, just a uniform. The utility company records confirmed he was on a week-long assignment in the Tampa Bay area during that exact window. The pattern was emerging with sickening clarity. He wasn't just killing, he was commuting. He treated murder like a business trip, a violent indulgence sandwiched between clocking in and clocking out. He would commit the unthinkable in one city, then drive home to his manicured lawn and his sleeping wife, washing the miles and the sins off his hands before sitting down for dinner. The detectives dubbed this phase of the investigation the corridor. They realized they were dealing with a serial predator who used the anonymity of the highway and the invisibility of the service worker to hunt without consequence. They began to interview his old co-workers, men who were now retired, fishing off piers and bouncing grandchildren on their knees. He was quiet, they all said. Kept to himself. Ate lunch in his van. Never stayed for the after-work beers. They had worked alongside a monster for years, sharing tools and complaints about the heat, never knowing that the man sitting next to them in the break room was mentally replaying the screams of a woman in Orlando or the terrified silence of a victim in Tampa. The banality of his evil was the most disturbing part. He didn't look like a killer. He looked like the guy who fixed your air conditioner. As the task force dug deeper, they found a disturbing evolution in his methodology. In 1982, he was impulsive at hunting in his own backyard. By 1988, he was cautious, using the cover of his job. By 1994, he was arrogant. In the Tampa case, a piece of jewelry belonging to the victim, a cheap, silver charm bracelet, had recently surfaced in a pawn shop database sold by a man matching his description just 2 days after the disappearance. He had kept it for a day, a quick souvenir, before discarding it for cash, treating a human life as a transaction. The receipt, dug out of microfiche archives, bore a signature that was a jagged, hasty scroll, but graphologists confirmed it matched the handwriting on the Good Neighbor Christmas cards he sent out every year. The evidence was tightening the news, linking the friendly man on the porch to a shadowy figure who haunted the I-4 corridor. This expanded investigation wasn't just about closing files, it was a race against the clock of biology. The killer was old now. His memory was failing, his health declining in the harsh environment of the state prison. Detectives knew they had a limited window to extract confessions before he took his secrets to the grave. They began a series of high-stakes interviews, driving to the prison with photos of the Orlando nursing student and the Tampa mother. They didn't yell. They didn't threaten. They simply laid the photos on the steel table next to his utility work logs. "We know you were there," they said. "We know you didn't just read meters that day." The look in his eyes shifted from the vacant stare of the courtroom to a flicker of recognition. It was the look of a man who realizes his secret collection is being put on public display. He didn't speak immediately, but his silence was no longer empty, it was heavy with the weight of specific, terrible memories that were finally being dragged into the light. The Florida 1982 case had cracked the door open, but it was the relentless pressure of the corridor investigation that was kicking it down. Families who had spent decades staring at phones that never rang were suddenly getting calls from detectives. "We have a lead," they were told. "We have a name." The hope was agonizing, a fragile thing mixed with dread. They had to reconcile the fact that their loved ones hadn't just vanished, they had been taken by a man who had likely walked past thousands of people, invisible in his plainness, hidden by his job, and protected by the assumption that monsters don't have 401k plans and work schedules. The narrative of the cold case was rewriting itself into a saga of a traveling nightmare, a man who sowed grief across the state map and then drove home to sleep the sleep of the just. The atmosphere inside a maximum security prison is a distinct, crushing weight, a pressurized environment where time doesn't flow, it drips. For the detectives of the corridor, a task force, entering the interrogation room was like stepping into the belly of a dormant beast. The walls were cinder block painted a nausea-inducing shade of institutional beige, and the air smelled of floor wax and stale despair. In the center of the room sat the man who had fooled a neighborhood for 42 years. He was no longer wearing the plaid shirts and khakis of the good neighbor. He was draped in the bright, dehumanizing orange of the State Department of Corrections, a color that finally matched the danger he represented. He sat with his hands folded on the steel table, his knuckles swollen with age, looking less like a monster and more like a grandfather waiting for a bus. But the eyes were the same. Those flat, shark-like eyes that had watched a young woman in 1982, a nursing student in 1988, and a mother in 1994. The detectives weren't there to intimidate him. You can't intimidate a man who has already lost his freedom. They were there to play a game of three-dimensional chess against a grandmaster of deception. The strategy was simple but high-risk: leverage his ego against his secrets. They knew that a man who keeps a lockbox of trophies is a man who takes pride in his work. He didn't kill out of frenzy, he killed out of a twisted sense of accomplishment. The lead investigator, a veteran with salt and pepper hair and a patience carved from granite, opened a file folder. He didn't speak. He simply slid a photograph across the cold metal surface. It wasn't a crime scene photo. It was a picture of a utility van, the exact make and model the killer had driven in the late 80s. Then he slid another photo, a timesheet, yellowed and faded, bearing the killer's signature. Then a third, a map of Orlando with a specific route highlighted in red. The silence stretched tight as a piano wire. The killer looked at the photos, then up at the detective. A small, dry smile played at the corners of his mouth. It was the first crack in the dam. He didn't deny it. He didn't ask for a lawyer. He simply leaned back and asked, "How did you find the timesheets?" "They banned those after 10 years. It was a validation, a subtle admission that he knew exactly where the conversation was going. The interrogation shifted from a legal inquiry to a macabre history lesson. The detectives pressed him on Orlando, 1988. They talked about the rain that night, the heavy tropical downpour that would have washed away fingerprints and tire tracks. They watched his face closely. When they mentioned the rain, his eyes lost focus for a second, drifting back to a memory stored in the deep archives of his brain. "It wasn't just rain," he whispered, his voice raspy from disuse. "It was a storm. The power was out on the whole block." The detail was specific, verifiable, and known only to the police and the perpetrator. He began to talk, not with guilt, but with a chilling nostalgia. He described the nursing student not as a human being, but as a shadow in the white uniform. He recounted how he had parked the van, put on his hard hat, and set up a perimeter of orange cones. To the passing cars, he was just a utility worker fixing a downed line. To the victim, he was authority, safety, a man doing a job. He described the abduction as efficient, a word that made the detective's blood run cold. He didn't remember her screaming, he remembered the sound of the rain drumming on the roof of the van, a rhythmic percussion to his violence. The psychological dance continued, moving west to Tampa, 1994. The detectives sensed he was enjoying this. For 40 years, he had been the smartest man in the room, the only one who knew the punchline to a terrible joke. Now, he was finally getting to share it. When they brought up the bus stop abduction, his demeanor changed. He became more animated, his hands unclasped. He talked about the heat of that day, the shimmering asphalt, the way the heat waves distorted the air. He remembered the grey work shirt the witness had seen. It was too hot for the long sleeves, he corrected them, a pedantic detail from a man who wanted the record to be accurate. I had rolled them up. He described the victim's charm bracelet, the one he had pawned. He chuckled dryly when they mentioned the pawn shop slip. Sloppy, he muttered. I was getting cocky. It was a terrifying glimpse into his mindset. He didn't regret the murder, he regretted the administrative error of leaving a paper trail. He viewed the killing as a successful project and the pawn slip as a minor failing in his otherwise perfect career. As the hours ground on, the room filled with the heavy, toxic vapor of his confessions. He didn't give them everything. He was still holding the ultimate power, the locations of the bodies. He would admit to the encounter, he would admit to the drive, but when asked where they were now, he would simply tap his temple and say, safe. It was a power play. He knew he was never leaving prison. The only currency he had left was the location of the remains, the final piece of the puzzle that would give the family's peace. He was spending that currency slowly, buying himself relevance, ensuring that the detectives would have to come back, would have to listen to him, would have to pay attention to the good neighbor who was actually a phantom. He was feeding them crumbs of truth wrapped in layers of manipulation. He implied that there were others, cases the police hadn't even connected yet, stops on his work route that were nothing more than empty dates on a calendar to the authorities but were red-letter days for him. The detectives left the room that evening drained, their souls scoured by the proximity to such concentrated evil. They had the confirmations they needed to close the Orlando and Tampa files, but the victory felt hollow. They realized that the man they had arrested for the 1982 murder wasn't just a local killer, he was a serial predator who had used the infrastructure of modern society, the utility grids, the highways, the anonymity of the service industry, as his weapon. He had turned the entire state of Florida into his hunting ground. The good neighbor persona wasn't just a mask, it was a necessary intermission between acts. He needed the lawn mowing and the barbecues to reset his equilibrium, to ground himself in reality before drifting back into the fantasy of control and death. The corridor was his playground, and the white van was his castle. Back in the squad room, the task force stared at the map on the wall. The red line of his work route now looked like a scar slashing across the state. They began to wonder about the gaps. What about the trips to Jacksonville in 1990? What about the contract work in Tallahassee in 1996? The killer had hinted at stops along the way, moments where he simply pulled over because the urge was too strong or the opportunity was too perfect. The partial confessions were devastating because they confirmed the methodology, but they left the scope of the horror undefined. Was he a killer of 3? Of 5? Of 10? The safe place in his mind where he kept the bodies was a vault the detectives had to crack, but the combination was locked inside a dying brain that viewed empathy as a foreign language. The ripple effect of these confessions was catastrophic for the families involved. The parents of the Orlando nursing student, who had spent decades hoping their daughter had simply run away to start a new life, were forced to confront the brutal reality that she had been taken by a man who looked like he was there to help. The children of the Tampa mother, who had grown up without her, now knew that her final moments were witnessed by a man who viewed her as a mile marker. The closure was violent and absolute. It stripped away the mystery and replaced it with the face of the man next door. The media frenzy ignited. The Florida 1982 case was now the utility killer saga, a sprawling narrative of institutional failure and predatory brilliance. People looked at utility vans differently. They looked at the men working on power lines with a newfound, primal suspicion. The killer had managed to poison the very trust that allows a society to function. In the solitude of his cell that night, the killer lay on his bunk, staring at the concrete ceiling. He wasn't plagued by guilt. He wasn't haunted by the ghosts of the women he had taken. He was replaying the interview, savoring the look of shock on the young detective's face when he mentioned the power outage in Orlando. He was reliving the glory days, not through the act of killing, but through the act of telling. He had transitioned from the hunter to the storyteller, and in his twisted mind, this was just the final chapter of his legacy. He knew the detectives would be back tomorrow. He knew they would bring more photos and more maps. And he would be ready. He had 40 years of secrets to ration out, 40 years of work to discuss. The good neighbor was dead, the monster was alive and holding court, and the audience was captivated. The investigation had morphed into a race against mortality. The killer's health was failing, his heart, black as it was giving out. The detectives knew they were working on a deadline set by biology. Every coughing fit in the interrogation room was a threat to the truth. They needed the bodies. They needed the physical proof to bring the families home. They began to use his own narcissism against him, suggesting that perhaps he wasn't as smart as he thought, that perhaps he had made mistakes he didn't know about. They challenged his memory, betting him to prove them wrong by revealing the burial sites. It was a dangerous, high-stakes psychological gamble, playing chicken with a psychopath who had nothing left to lose. The interrogation tapes from those weeks are a chilling archive of human darkness, a monologue of a man who found purpose in destruction and now found pleasure in the devastation of those trying to understand him. The corridor confessions prove that evil doesn't always look like a monster. Sometimes it wears a work shirt with a name patch. It drives the speed limit. It stops at red lights. It waves at children. The true horror of the Florida case wasn't just the violence, it was the integration. He was part of the fabric of the day-to-day, a thread of darkness woven so tight into the quilt of normal life that you couldn't see it until it began to unravel. And now that it was unraveling, the picture it revealed was more terrifying than anyone had dared to imagine. The map on the wall was filling up with red pins, and each pin was a life cut short by a man who treated murder like just another stop on his daily route. Following the conviction, the narrative of the Starling case shifted from the courtroom to the dark, intricate corridors of the human mind. The public, now satisfied by the verdict, found themselves grappling with a far more unsettling question: how? How does a man carve a woman's throat in a frozen park and then, less than 48 hours later, chair a board meeting for a children's hospital with steady hands and a compassionate smile? The answer lay in the terrifying anatomy of Arthur Penhaligon's psyche. Forensic psychologists and criminal profilers who descended upon the case files didn't see a man suffering from a split personality. They saw a masterpiece of compartmentalization. Penhaligon was diagnosed post-trial as a high-functioning sociopath with narcissistic features, a clinical label for a man who didn't just lack empathy, he viewed it as a weakness to be exploited in others. He had spent 50 years perfecting the art of mimetic behavior. He didn't feel goodness, but he studied it with the obsession of a scholar. He learned the precise cadence of a comforting voice, the exact angle of a sympathetic nod, the specific vocabulary that signaled integrity to the British upper class. His life was a performance art piece, a continuous play where he was the star, the director, and the only audience member who knew the plot. The investigation into his financial records revealed that his charitable donations often coincided with the anniversaries of his crimes, not as acts of atonement, but as payments for his continued camouflage. He was buying his own legend, brick by brick, check by check. The detail that chilled the investigators the most was the saga of the cufflink. A silver lion found at the scene had been a catastrophic error, a rare crack in his discipline. The police discovered that in late November 1975, just weeks after the murder, Penhaligon had commissioned a silversmith in Zurich to create a custom replica of the lost item. He claimed he had lost the original during a sailing trip. For 50 years, he wore the replica to galas and weddings, a secret joke that he flaunted in the face of the society he despised. He kept the remaining original cufflink in his velvet box not out of sentiment, but as a reminder of the one mistake he swore never to repeat. It was a trophy of his own fallibility, a jagged edge he kept to keep himself sharp. But as the police began to peel back the layers of his timeline, the darkness spread far beyond Claire Starling. The DNA had only convicted him of one murder, but the modus operandi, the surgical precision, the lack of struggle, the high society proximity, began to align with other ghosts in the London archives. Detectives opened the files on 3 other women who had vanished between 1972 and 1979, a nurse from Battersea, a debutante from Chelsea, and a young librarian from Fulham. All 3 had disappeared on foggy nights. All 3 had last been seen near venues where Penhaligon was known to socialize. Their bodies were never found, likely because the silent slasher had learned from his first public display with Claire. He had evolved. He had stopped leaving them for the world to find and started hiding them where only he could visit. Penhaligon refused to speak about these potential victims. His silence was his final act of control, a way to keep the families in eternal purgatory while he rotted in prison. He took the locations of their graves to his own, leaving a legacy of open wounds that science, for all its power, could not yet heal. The Pillar of Kent was revealed to be a serial predator who had used the fog of the 70s as a hunting blind. The realization sent a shockwave through the institutions he had led. The hospitals, the charities, the legal associations, they were all tainted by the realization that their benevolent leader was a monster. The Great Erasure began immediately. Plaques bearing his name were unscrewed from hospital wings in the dead of night. His portrait was removed from the hall of the Magistrates Association and burned in a private ceremony that felt like an exorcism. The university that had granted him an honorary doctorate rescinded it in a press release that dripped with shame. But you cannot scrub a memory. The story of Arthur Penhaligon became a modern cautionary tale, a grim reminder that status is not a proxy for soul. The community that had once held him as a hero now looked at their own leaders with a new, cynical eye. The trust was broken. The Sterling case proved that the most dangerous monsters aren't the ones hiding in the shadows, they are the ones sitting at the head of the table, smiling, waiting for the applause to die down so they can go back to their work in the dark. The manor house in Kent became a focal point for this national trauma. It stood empty, stripped of its furniture and its false walls, a hollow shell that attracted vandals and true crime tourists. The local council debated its fate. To leave it standing was to honor a killer, to demolish it was to erase the history of his deception. In the end, the bulldozers came. The House of the Lion was reduced to rubble, the ivy-covered bricks pulverized into red dust. But even as the walls came down, the locals claimed the air around the property felt heavy, charged with the residue of 50 years of lies. The physical structure was gone, but the psychological scar on the landscape remained. For the surviving members of the Sterling family, this phase of the aftermath was a complex agony. They had won, but the victory was Pyrrhic. They had exposed the man, but they couldn't undo the 50 years of silence that had destroyed their parents. Claire's brother, now the custodian of her memory, found himself inundated with letters from strangers, people who had suspected Penhaligon of minor cruelties over the years but had been too afraid to speak up against a pillar. It was a flood of hindsight. The neighbor who saw him burning clothes in the garden. The clerk who noticed his icy temper. The dots had been there for half a century, but no one had dared to connect them because the picture they formed was too terrified to contemplate. The case also sparked a fierce debate about the nature of justice and time. Was it truly justice to imprison a man in his 80s, a man who had already lived a full life of luxury and acclaim? Penhaligon had enjoyed the prime of his life while Claire lay in the cold earth. He had tasted fine wine, heard beautiful music, and traveled the world. The life sentence was a symbolic gesture, a way for society to say we know, but it couldn't reclaim the stolen years. The justice felt mathematical, the balancing of the books that left the emotional account still overdrawn. The public was left with a lingering, bitter taste, the knowledge that sometimes, evil doesn't just survive, it thrives, and it only fails when the biology it leaves behind finally betrays it. As the media frenzy began to wane, the true legacy of the case settled over London like a new kind of fog, a fog of suspicion. The Sterling Protocol became the standard for reviewing the backgrounds of public figures involved in criminal cases. The presumption of innocence was no longer a shield for the powerful, it was a hypothesis to be tested. The silver lion cufflink, now resting in the archives of the Black Museum, became a symbol of this shift. It was a small, glittering warning. Look closer. Look past the suit. Look past the title. Look past the donation. Beneath the veneer of the good man might be a predator waiting for the lights to go out. The silent slasher was behind bars, but he had succeeded in one final, terrible aim. He had killed the city's innocence, leaving behind a wall that would never again look at a pillar of the community without wondering what was buried beneath the foundation. The convoy carrying the evidence cases moved south, leaving the humid, insect-choked air of the Panhandle for the sterile, fluorescent-lit purgatory of the State Forensic Laboratory. The transition was jarring. One moment, the remains were part of the earth, shrouded in the chaos of roots and mud. The next, they were laid out on stainless steel tables, under lights so bright they left no shadow. This is where the final battle of the Florida 1982 case was fought, not with guns or handcuffs, but with dental charts, mitochondrial DNA, and the quiet, methodical patience of science. The room hummed with the sound of ventilation systems scrubbing the air, a white noise that covered the heavy silence of the technicians. They weren't just examining bones, they were handling the lost chapters of a family's history. The ID card found in the mud was a strong lead, but in a court of law, it wasn't proof. The proof had to come from the marrow, from the genetic code that had survived the swamp, the heat, and the decades of neglect. The process was agonizingly slow for the families waiting by their phones, but inside the lab, it moved with the precision of a ticking clock. Forensic anthropologists cleaned the fragments, piecing together the skeletal puzzle. They looked for the telltale markers of injury, a fracture here, a cut mark there, that would tell the story of the final moments. But the identity, the who, came down to the genetics. When the sequence finally appeared on the monitor, a cascading series of peaks and valleys on a graph, it was a perfect overlay. The DNA extracted from the femur found in the Panhandle matched the sample provided by the parents of the Orlando nursing student 36 years prior. The computer didn't offer sympathy. It didn't offer condolences. It just offered a match probability of 99.99%. The Jane Doe of the swamp was officially reclaimed. She was a daughter again. She was a sister. She was a name. But she wasn't alone. The soil from the excavation site yielded more than one secret. As the technicians processed the other fragments found nearby, the ones associated with the tarnished belt buckle, a second profile began to emerge. It was a partial match, degraded and difficult to read, but it was enough. It pointed west to the Tampa case of 1994. The single mother who had vanished from the bus stop. The woman whose children were now adults, parents themselves, who had grown up with a hole in their lives shaped like a missing mother. The fishing spot wasn't just a grave for one, it was a cluster. The killer hadn't just visited the Panhandle once, he had returned. He had treated that remote patch of wilderness as a personal landfill for his sins. The realization turned the lab into a place of profound sorrow. Two families, separated by years and miles, were about to be united by the same tragedy. The notification teams assembled in the parking lot of the police station. This is the part of the job that never makes the movies, the walk up the driveway. It is the longest walk in law enforcement. Detectives straightened their ties, checked their files, and took a deep breath of the hot Florida air. They weren't bringing good news. They weren't bringing a miracle. They were bringing an end. For the parents of the Orlando student, now in their 80s, the knock on the door was a sound they had rehearsed in their nightmares for over 10,000 nights. When they saw the detectives, the solemn faces, the lack of urgency, they knew. There was no need for words. The mother collapsed into a chair, a sound escaping her throat that wasn't quite a cry, but a release of pressure that had been building since 1988. "She's found," the detective said softly. Just 2 words. But they carried the weight of the world. The ambiguity was gone. The what-ifs were silenced. In Tampa, the scene was different but equally shattering. The victim's son, who was just a boy when his mother vanished, stood in the doorway of his own suburban home. He looked at the officers with a hardened, weary expression. He had spent his life waiting for her to walk back through the door, or waiting to hear she was dead. He had lived in the limbo of the unsolved. When the news was delivered that she had been found in a swamp hundreds of miles away, the victim of the good neighbor, the reaction was a quiet, crushing devastation. He didn't cry immediately. He just nodded, looking past the detectives at the street, as if reevaluating his entire life through the lens of this new truth. At least she wasn't alone, he whispered, a heartbreaking attempt to find a sliver of comfort in the horror. At least we know where she is. The ripple effect of these identifications was seismic. The corridor theory was no longer a theory, it was a confirmed historical fact. The killer wasn't just a suspect in these cases, he was the architect of them. The media exploded. The faces of the nursing student and the Tampa mother were plastered on screens across the country, side by side with the mugshot of the kind old man from the suburbs. The contrast was nauseating. Here were the vibrant, smiling faces of the victims, full of life, and there was the face of the man who had snuffed them out like candles, simply because he could. The narrative of the good neighbor was fully dismantled. He was exposed as a monster who had turned the geography of Florida into a map of trauma. The families, now linked by a shared grief, began to reach out to one another, forming a club that no one wants to join, the survivors of the utility killer. Back in the prison, the news of the identifications reached the killer not through a lawyer, but through the television in the common room. He watched the report, his face impassive, chewing on his lip. He didn't look remorseful. He looked annoyed. His secrets, the ones he had hoarded like gold, were being spent without his permission. The power was shifting. He was no longer the keeper of the keys, he was just an old man in a cage, stripped of his mystery. The detectives visited him the next day. They didn't bring photos this time. They brought the finalized forensic reports. They slammed the thick binders onto the table. "They are home," the lead detective said, his voice hard as iron. "We brought them home." The killer looked at the binders and then looked away, shrinking slightly in his chair. For the first time, the good neighbor looked small. The swamp hadn't protected him. The years hadn't protected him. The science had hunted him down, and the ghosts of the corridor were finally standing in the room, demanding to be heard. The shift from the humid, mosquito-choked air of the panhandle to the sterile, mahogany-paneled interior of the state attorney's office marked a new chapter in the war against the good neighbor. The forensic victory in the lab was absolute, but in the eyes of the law, it was just the ammunition for a battle that was about to be fought on paper. The prosecutors weren't satisfied with the single life sentence he was already serving for the 1982 case. That was for the girl down the street. The new evidence, the belt buckle, the DNA from the swamp, the work logs, demanded a reckoning for the nursing student in Orlando and the mother in Tampa. They prepared the indictments with the precision of surgeons, layering the physical evidence with the circumstantial timelines of his utility work. This wasn't just about adding years to a sentence that would already outlast his natural life, it was about officially branding him for what he truly was, a serial killer. The state of Florida, known for its unforgiving stance on capital crimes, was ready to drop the hammer. The headlines shifted from "cold case solved" to "the corridor killer," a moniker that stripped away his suburban camouflage and exposed the predator beneath. Inside the prison, the atmosphere in the killer's cell changed. The game of cat and mouse he had enjoyed with the detectives, the cryptic clues about praying hands and fishing spots, had backfired. He had thought he was doling out breadcrumbs to keep them interested, to keep himself relevant. He hadn't expected them to actually find the bakery. When he was served with the new indictments, formally charging him with 2 counts of first-degree murder, the mask of the weary, cooperative old man fell away completely. He wasn't repentant. He was furious. In his twisted logic, he felt betrayed. He had given them the location, and instead of thanking him or offering him concessions, they were using it to nail him to the wall. The narcissism that had allowed him to live a double life for 40 years suddenly flared up like a dying star. He realized that the narrative was slipping out of his hands. The police were telling the story now. The DNA was telling the story. And in that story, he wasn't a genius or a mastermind, he was just a pathetic, sloppy old man who had kept the wrong souvenirs. His response was a desperate, calculated attempt to seize back the spotlight. If he couldn't control the courtroom, he would control the airwaves. He fired his public defender, a weary lawyer who had tried to save him from the death penalty, and filed a motion to represent himself. It was a classic move from the psychopath's playbook, turn the trial into a circus where he is the ringmaster. But he didn't stop there. He began to write. Sitting on his bunk, armed with a dull pencil and legal pads purchased from the commissary, he started drafting letters to the major news stations in Miami, Orlando, and Tampa. He titled them The Misunderstood Life, a grotesque memoir that attempted to reframe his actions not as murders, but as necessary removals driven by a complex philosophy that only he understood. He wasn't writing a confession, he was writing a manifesto. He wanted to explain the why, to justify the unjustifiable, and to force the world to look at him not with disgust, but with awe. The media, hungry for the next twist in the sensational saga, hesitated but eventually bit. Excerpts of his letters began to appear on the nightly news and in Sunday papers. The tone was chillingly mundane. He wrote about the urge as if it were a weather pattern, something inevitable and natural. He criticized the detectives for missing the big picture and claimed there were details about the victims that only I truly appreciate. It was a psychological assault on the families. Imagine turning on your television to see the man who murdered your daughter trying to position himself as a victim of circumstance, a tortured soul who was simply wired differently. The audacity was breathless. He was trying to monetize his infamy, to trade the blood on his hands for ink on a page. The good neighbor was gone, replaced by a wannabe celebrity who viewed his trial as a book tour. The legal system found itself in a bind. The judge, a stern woman with decades on the bench, saw exactly what he was doing. She ordered a competency hearing, not because she thought he was insane, but because she needed to establish on the record that his grandstanding was the product of a calculating mind, not a broken one. The hearings were a spectacle. The killer sat in the box, wearing his orange jumpsuit like a tuxedo, arguing legal precedents he had read in the prison library. He challenged the chain of custody on the belt buckle. He argued that the search of the swamp was unconstitutional. He spoke with a calm, articulate cadence that unnerved everyone in the room. He wasn't ranting, he was lecturing. He wanted the world to see how smart he was, how he could tangle with the state's best lawyers and hold his own. It was a performance, and for a terrifying moment, it seemed like he might actually derail the proceedings with procedural chaos. For the prosecutors, the strategy shifted. They couldn't let him turn the courtroom into a soapbox. They moved to have his letters excluded from evidence, arguing they were self-serving hearsay. They fought to keep the cameras out of the courtroom, denying him the televised audience he craved. The battle wasn't just about guilt or innocence anymore, that had been decided by the DNA. The battle was about dignity. It was about denying him the satisfaction of re-traumatizing the community. They reached out to the families of the Orlando and Tampa victims, preparing them for the likelihood that he would try to cross-examine them himself. The thought was nauseating, a mother having to answer questions from the man who killed her daughter, while he stood just feet away, acting the part of the lawyer. It was a form of legal torture, and the killer knew it. He relished the prospect. But the state had a card to play as well. They began to dismantle his mastermind image in the press, leaking details of his interrogation that painted him not as a genius, but as a coward. They released the transcripts where he stumbled over dates, where he guessed wrong about details, where he whined about the prison food. They punctured his ego by showing the world the pathetic reality of his existence. He wasn't Hannibal Lecter, he was a sad, lonely old man who had killed women because he was too weak to deal with his own inadequacies. The narrative war heated up. The killer, sensing that his memoir wasn't getting the reverence he expected, became more erratic. He started filing frivolous motions, demanding a new judge, demanding better lighting in his cell, demanding access to his old trophy collection to refresh his memory. Each motion was a desperate wave from a drowning man, a signal that his control was evaporating. The climax of this legal maneuvering came during a pre-trial hearing regarding the admissibility of the corridor evidence. The killer stood up to argue his motion to suppress the swamp findings. He spoke for 20 minutes, the rambling, disjointed speech that touched on his childhood, his work at the utility company, and his artistic vision. The courtroom was silent, but it wasn't the silence of respect, it was the silence of witnessing a meltdown. When he finished, the judge looked over her glasses and delivered a ruling that cut through his delusions like a scalpel. She denied every single motion. She stripped him of his self-representation rights, citing his disruptive behavior and lack of legal understanding. She appointed a public defender to handle the case, effectively gagging him. The look on his face was one of pure, unadulterated shock. The microphone was cut. The audience was gone. He was just a defendant again. The impact of this shutdown was palpable. The families exhaled. The media circus packed up its tents. The killer was returned to his cell, stripped of his pen and paper, left alone with the silence he hated so much. But even in defeat, he had managed to leave a stain. His letters, his motions, his brief moment of acting as his own attorney, it all served as a reminder of the malignant narcissism that fueled his crimes. He had tried to write the ending of his own story, an ending where he went down as a legendary outlaw. Instead, the legal system had forced the pen from his hand and handed it back to the victims. The upcoming trial for the corridor murders will not be the state versus the genius, it will be the people versus the coward. As the date for the second trial approached, the killer retreated into a sullen, brooding silence. He refused to meet with his appointed counsel. He refused to leave his cell for recreation. He had lost the only thing that mattered to him, the ability to manipulate the world around him. He was no longer the good neighbor waving from the porch, and he was no longer the misunderstood anti-hero writing memoirs. He was simply inmate 08934, a number in a database, waiting to be processed for crimes that had lost their mystery and retained only their horror. The system had finally done what the swamp couldn't, it had swallowed him whole, digesting his ego until there was nothing left but the raw, ugly truth of his actions. The courtroom for the second trial was stripped of all theatrics. Gone were the cameras, the frenzied reporters shouting questions from the steps, and the self-aggrandizing motions of a killer trying to direct his own biopic. What remained was a chamber of heavy, polished wood and breathless silence, a space where the air felt pressurized, as if the entire weight of the state of Florida was pressing down on the defense table. The good neighbor, now represented by a court-appointed attorney he barely acknowledged, sat slumped in his chair. The arrogance that had fueled his manifesto was gone, replaced by a sullen, shrinking posture. He looked less like a predator and more like a discarded husk, the man whose internal batteries had finally run dry. But make no mistake, the monster was still there, lurking behind the roomy eyes, listening to every word, calculating the angles of a cage that had no exit. This wasn't a trial about if, it was a trial about how much. It was a ceremony of accountability for the ghosts of the corridor. The prosecution opened not with a shout, but with a whisper. The lead attorney, a woman with eyes that had seen too much darkness, walked to the center of the room and placed a single object on the evidence table, the rusted belt buckle found in the Panhandle swamp. It sat there, a small, corroded piece of metal under the harsh fluorescent lights, looking ancient and alien. This, she said, her voice carrying to the back row without a microphone, is the only thing that survived the defendant's mercy. The opening statement was a masterclass in narrative reconstruction. She didn't just list dates and times, she rebuilt the world of the victims. She took the jury back to the rain-slicked streets of Orlando in 1988, to the suffocating heat of the Tampa bus stop in 1994. She painted the killer not as a man, but as a force of nature, a hurricane that wore a utility uniform, tearing through lives and leaving nothing but debris in his wake. She projected the map of the corridor onto the screen, the red line of his work route glowing like an artery, pulsed with the stops where he had paused to destroy a life. As the forensic evidence was presented, the courtroom transformed into a lecture hall of the macabre. The jury, 12 ordinary citizens pulled from their daily lives, leaned forward, mesmerized and horrified. They saw the DNA charts, the jagged peaks of probability that linked the bone fragments in the mud to the weeping families in the gallery. They saw the overlay of the killer's timesheets, the handwritten logs where he had documented his location with mundane precision, unaware that 40 years later, those same logs would serve as his confession. The defense attorney did his job, raising objections about chain of custody and environmental degradation, but it was a performance of futility. You cannot argue with math. You cannot cross-examine a molecule. The evidence was a monolith, a towering wall of fact that cast a long, cold shadow over the defendant. He didn't look at the screen. He stared at his hands, tracing the lines on his palms, perhaps remembering the steering wheel of the white van, the vibration of the engine, the feeling of control he had lost forever. Then came the testimonies. This is the moment when the sterile nature of the law bleeds into the raw agony of the human experience. The father of the Orlando nursing student took the stand first. He was a man carved from the old school, stoic and proud, but time had hollowed him out. He walked with a cane, the tapping sound echoing on the floorboards like a metronome. When he sat down, he didn't look at the jury. He looked straight at the killer. It was a stare that could peel paint, a look of pure, distilled hatred mixed with an infinite sorrow. He spoke of the night she vanished, of the phone calls that never came, of the 36 Christmases where a chair sat empty at the table. He didn't cry. He was past tears. He spoke with the quiet fury of a man who has had to outlive his own heart. You stole her future, he said, his voice trembling only once. But you didn't steal her name. We got that back. The killer shifted in seat, refusing to meet the old man's eyes, a coward hiding from the wreckage he had caused. Next was the son of the Tampa victim. He was younger, his anger more volatile, vibrating with the energy of a life defined by absence. He described growing up wondering if his mother had abandoned him, a cruel doubt that the killer had planted and watered for decades. He talked about the rumors, the whispers in the neighborhood, the psychological torture of not knowing. You let me believe she didn't want me, he said, pointing a finger at the defense table, a gesture that felt like a physical blow. You let a child think he wasn't loved, just so you could keep your secret. The raw emotion in the room was suffocating. Jurors were openly weeping, wiping their eyes with tissues, overwhelmed by the sheer scale of the cruelty. It wasn't just murder, it was a theft of truth, a theft of peace, a theft of reality itself. The killer remained motionless, a stone statue in an orange jumpsuit, absorbing the hatred but reflecting nothing. The closing arguments were brief. The prosecution didn't need to yell. They simply pointed to the empty chairs in the front row, the spaces occupied by the ghosts of the women he had taken. He treated the state of Florida as his hunting ground, the prosecutor said, her voice dropping to a register of steel. He treated these women as mile markers. He buried them in a swamp because he thought they were trash. Today, we tell him that he is the one who belongs in the dark. The defense offered a standard plea for mercy, citing his age and his health, arguing that a life sentence was a death sentence anyway. It was a hollow argument, a whisper against a hurricane. The jury didn't need to deliberate for days. They didn't need to review the binders. They walked out, drank the bad coffee in the deliberation room, looked at each other with eyes that said, enough, and walked back in. The verdict was swift, unanimous, and crushing. Guilty on all counts. The sentencing hearing was the final act of this tragedy. In Florida, the law allows for the victims' families to speak one last time before the judge passes sentence. This wasn't testimony, this was a release. The gallery was packed. People stood along the walls, detectives who had worked the cold case, neighbors from the street where he had lived his lie, and strangers who had been captivated by the horror of the corridor killer. The judge, the same woman who had silenced his media circus, looked down from the bench. She wore an expression of cold judgment, the face of a society that has run out of patience. She asked the defendant if he had anything to say. For a moment, the room held its breath. Would he confess? Would he apologize? Would he finally reveal the locations of other victims, the stops he had hinted at in his interviews? The killer stood up, his chains rattling. He looked around the courtroom, his eyes scanning the faces of the people who hated him. A smirk, small, almost imperceptible, tugged at the corner of his mouth. It was a long time ago, he rasped, his voice sounding like dry leaves scraping together. I don't remember much. It was a final, petty insult. A denial of their pain. A refusal to give them the satisfaction of his remorse. He was taking his power back the only way he knew how, by withholding the one thing they wanted most. A collective gasp of anger went through the room, but the judge didn't flinch. She leaned into the microphone. You may not remember, she said, her voice booming through the speakers, but the record will remembering for you. You tried to be a ghost, sir. You tried to be invisible. But today, you are seen. And you will be seen every day for the rest of your life, inside a 6x8 concrete box. She sentenced him to 3 consecutive life terms without the possibility of parole, to be served after the completion of his current sentence. It was a symbolic piling on of years, a mathematical assurance that his body would never leave the prison system. But she didn't stop there. She ordered that the photos of the victims, the nursing student and the mother, be placed in his file so that every time he went up for a status review, every time he saw a doctor, every time he filed a grievance, those faces would be the first things he saw. It was a judicial haunting, the legal curse placed upon his remaining days. The gavel came down with a sound like a gunshot, a final punctuation mark to 40 years of silence. Crack. The sound echoed off the wood paneling, ringing in the ears of everyone present. As the bailiffs moved in to shackle him for transport, the killer looked small. The good neighbor persona had completely dissolved. The mastermind delusion was shattered. He was just an old man with bad knees and a bad heart, shuffling toward a door that led to nowhere. He didn't look back at the gallery. He didn't look at the families. He kept his head down, staring at the floor, perhaps finally seeing the abyss opening up beneath his feet. The walk from the defense table to the side door was short, but it felt like an eternity. Every step was a step away from the sun, away from the world of the living, deeper into the tomb he had built for himself. When the heavy door clicked shut behind him, the sound was different than the gavel. It was the sound of a book closing. The air in the courtroom shifted. The pressure released. People began to breathe again. Outside, on the courthouse steps, the sunlight was blinding. The Florida heat was waiting, thick and humid, just as it had been in 1982. But the quality of the light felt different. It felt cleaner. The families gathered in a tight circle, holding on to each other, a huddle of survivors who had walked through fire and come out the other side. They spoke to the cameras, but their voices were calm. They didn't talk about him. They talked about the women. They said their names. They told stories about who they were before the darkness took them. They reclaimed the narrative. That corridor was no longer his hunting ground, it was a memorial. The map had been redrawn. The red line of his route was erased, replaced by the gold line of justice. The convoy carrying the prisoners sped away, merging onto the highway, heading toward the maximum security facility deep in the interior of the state. He watched the world blur past the reinforced window, the palm trees, the strip malls, the endless construction. He was passing the exits he used to take. He was passing the neighborhoods he used to stalk. But he was just a passenger now. The road belonged to everyone else. He was heading to a place where there were no porches, no hibiscus plants, no neighbors to fool. He was going to a place where the only thing that mattered was the count, the routine, and the long, silent nights where the only company he would have were the memories he claimed to have forgotten. Back in the empty courtroom, the janitor began to sweep the floor. He moved the chairs back into place. He wiped down the tables. The physical traces of the trial were removed, but the energy remained. The wood seemed to vibrate with the echoes of the testimony. It was a space that had witnessed the worst of humanity and the best of the legal system. The case of Florida 1982 was officially closed. The files would be boxed up, sent to the archives, and placed on a shelf. But the story wasn't over. It had seeped into the groundwater of the state. It had become a cautionary tale, a legend, a dark folklore that parents would tell their children. Be careful, they would say. You never really know who is watching. As night fell over the city, the lights of the skyline flickered on. In the neighborhood where it all began, 3 blocks from the scene of the first crime, a porch light turned on. Then another. Then another. A string of lights pushing back the dark. The house where the killer lived was dark, its windows like dead eyes, the void in the middle of the street. But around it, life continued. The grass grew. The children played. The world moved on. The scar would always be there, a jagged line running through the history of the town, but the wound was no longer bleeding. The silence had been broken, and in the end, the truth was the only voice that mattered. The metal door of the cell didn't just lock him in, it locked the world out. As the years in maximum security ground on, the man who had once been the good neighbor dissolved into the gray, indistinguishable sludge of the prison population. There is a specific kind of justice in the way a narcissist dies behind bars, not with a grand, final speech, but in total, suffocating irrelevance. He became inmate 08934, a number whispered by no one. The media vans had long since moved on to the next tragedy, the next headline, leaving him with nothing but the silence he had forced upon his victims. He spent his final days in the geriatric ward, a place that smells of antiseptic and decay, surrounded by other broken men who had done terrible things. The sharp, predatory mind that had outsmarted the police for 40 years began to fray, eaten away by dementia and the monotony of a life measured in tray slots and head counts. He would sit for hours staring at the wall, mumbling about routes and rain, a broken record skipping on the grooves of his own atrocities. It is a terrifying thing to realize that the face of evil is not always a twisted mask of rage. Often, it is the face of the man who holds the door for you at the post office. It is the face of the man who recommends a plumber. It is the face of the man who lives 3 blocks away. This case forces us to confront the uncomfortable truth that we do not truly know the people around us. We see the projection, the carefully curated avatar of a citizen, father, friend. We don't see the basement of the soul. We don't see the thoughts that churn behind the eyes while they smile and ask about the weather. The good neighbor defense was so effective because it preyed on our biological need to trust the tribe. We want to believe that the monsters are outsiders, drifters, people who look dangerous. We recoil at the idea that the monster has a mortgage and a lawnmower. This case shattered that comfort. It proved that the most dangerous camouflage is not a ghillie suit in the bushes, but a polo shirt and a pair of khakis in the driveway. The legacy of the Florida 1982 investigation goes far beyond the conviction of one old man. It stands as a monument to the relentless, unforgiving march of science. When he killed in the 80s, he was operating in a world of analog limitations. He thought in terms of fingerprints and footprints. He couldn't conceive of a future where a microscopic flake of skin could be amplified, sequenced, and traced back to his great-grandfather's lineage. He was a creature of the 20th century hunted by the technology of the 21st. The genealogy unit that caught him sent a signal flare into the dark corners of the criminal world. To every cold case killer still living free, still thinking they got away with it, this case is a promise, the clock is not your friend. The evidence you left behind, the evidence you think has degraded or disappeared, is waiting. It is sitting in a box, in a freezer, in an envelope, waiting for the algorithm that will decode it. You can run from the police, you can run from the witnesses, but you cannot run from your own biology. As his health failed, the killer tried one last time to exert control. He refused medication. He refused food. He wanted to dictate the terms of his exit. But the system didn't allow it. They kept him alive not out of mercy, but out of obligation to the sentence. He was denied the dignity of a quick end. He was forced to wither. In his final hours, drifting in and out of consciousness, nurses reported that he wasn't asking for forgiveness. He wasn't calling out for his family. He was terrified of the dark. The man who had plunged so many others into the abyss was, in the end, a child afraid of the lights going out. When he finally flatlined, there was no thunder, no lightning. Just the ceaseless beep of a monitor and the scratching of a pen on a death certificate. His body was unclaimed. His family, the wife and children he had used as props for his normal life, wanted nothing to do with his remains. He was cremated at the state's expense, his ashes placed in a generic plastic container, unmourned and unloved. He had spent a lifetime trying to be somebody, he died as nobody. But while he turned to ash, the memory of the women he took began to shine with a new, fierce light. The community didn't just move on, they evolved. The street where the first abduction happened is no longer defined by the crime. It is defined by the resilience of the people who stayed. The house where the victim lived is now home to a new generation, a family who knows the story but refuses to be haunted by it. They planted a garden in the spot where the police cars once parked. Life, in its stubborn, beautiful way, has overgrown the scar. The families of the corridor victims, the nursing student and the mother, found a strange, powerful kinship. They meet once a year, not to mourn the killer, but to celebrate the daughters and mothers they lost. They have taken the narrative back. They talk about the lives these women lived, not the death they died. They have ensured that the killer is a footnote in their history, not the title chapter. Yet the lingering ghost remains in the collective psyche of the town. You can feel it on the humid nights when the wind dies down and the Spanish moss hangs motionless from the oaks. It's a subtle shift in behavior, a generational instinct passed down from the parents who lived through the panic of 1982. People lock their doors a little earlier here. They watch the street a little longer when a car drives slowly by. They are polite to their neighbors, yes, but there is a distance, the reserve that wasn't there before. The innocence of the open door is gone, replaced by a vigilant wisdom. They know now that normal is a fragile construct. They know that the man watering his hibiscus might be a saint, or he might be a sinner, and the only difference is what he keeps in the lockbox in his garage. This cynicism is the killer's final, poisonous gift to the world, a permanent erosion of trust. The house 3 blocks away, the killer's house, stood empty for a long time. It became a dark tooth in the bright smile of the suburb. Kids dared each other to run up and touch the porch. Urban explorers tried to break in, looking for the secret rooms the news talked about. Eventually, it was sold to a developer who bulldozed it. They tore it down to the dirt, crushing the garage, the living room, the walls that had absorbed his secrets. They carted the debris away to a landfill, mixing the atoms of his sanctuary with the trash of the city. A new house stands there now, modern and bright, with no history and no ghosts. But the locals know. They know that the soil underneath the foundation remembers. They drive past and inadvertently glance at the driveway, half expecting to see the white van, half expecting to see him waving. It is a reminder that places have memories, and some stains are too deep for concrete to cover. The story of the Florida 1982 cold case is, ultimately, a story about the endurance of truth. It lay dormant for 40 years, buried under lies, buried under mud, buried under the facade of a suburban dream. But truth is like water, it always finds a way out. It drips through the cracks of a story that doesn't add up. It seeps through the walls of a garage. It rises from the swamp. The killer thought he could bury the truth along with the bodies, but he forgot that the earth itself is a witness. He forgot that every contact leaves a trace. He built a fortress of lies, but he built it on a foundation of sand, and all it took was one drop of science to wash it all away. As the sun sets over the Florida peninsula tonight, casting long purple shadows across the sawgrass and the subdivisions, the case is closed. The files are boxed. The evidence is stored. The detectives have retired, their watch finally ended. But in the quiet of the evening, when the crickets start their chorus and the porch lights flicker on against the gathering dark, we are left with the final, haunting question. It is not who did it. We know who. It is not how he did it. We know how. The question that keeps us awake, the question that lingers in the silence of the room, is simply, who is next door? We look through our blinds at the house across the street. We see the blue glow of a television. We see a silhouette move past the window. We see a neighbor putting out the recycling bin. And we wonder, is that just a life being lived? Or is it a performance, a mask, a normal life hiding a darkness we can't even comprehend? The killer is gone, but he left us with this mirror, forcing us to look at our own world and realize that the most terrifying mysteries aren't the ones in the history books. They are the ones living, breathing, and waving hello, right there, just blocks away. The screen fades to black. The voiceover ends. The silence returns. But this time, the silence isn't empty. It is awake. And it is watching.